Fantastic. Thank you for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning. So my name's Jen Horse-Hewitt. I am a Director for Global City Strategy within Accenture, a global management consulting technology firm. And joined with me, I have a very esteemed panel. We've got a great diversity of perspectives, I think. So we're going to be looking specifically at this question of how do you retain Britain's standing within the smart cities global race, I suppose, and get some perspectives from both people working within the public sector, within cities, and also people on the private sector side of the equation. So to begin with, I just wanted to plant a few seeds from my own experience in this market and discuss a little bit how we've seen the debate mature over the past years. So I personally started getting involved with smart cities as it sort of spun out of the smart grid discussion in around 2008. And I think what we've seen over time has been an evolution from a very tech-driven, and I think companies like ourselves would be culpable of that as well, but a very technology-driven conversation around smart cities to something which, as you hear from the panel today, is a lot more diverse and also is cognizant of the data side of the equation versus the technology side of the equation, and a lot more about data-led innovation we hear now versus technology platforms, which was a lot of the rhetoric previously. I think there's also a transition away from it being a very infrastructure and engineering conversation to being something that's much more about lifestyle services, conversations around public safety, around vulnerable children, around adult social care, much more of a diversity around what are the actual potential use cases that we can enable through this data-led innovation. And the third, I guess, reflection is the clarity at which we are expecting people to articulate the value of these technology interventions or these data-led interventions. So I think, we are getting a lot better at saying this does need to be clearly articulated to the diversity of stakeholders that are involved in this, and a lot more time and attention, including from the British Standards Institute, etc., is being spent on getting smarter about defining what the value is to this new area. So, I genuinely thought there was a lot of hype in smart cities that was not that helpful for the past few years, and there was some critics maybe that would say maybe this concept will sort of wane and it will become something that was sort of, too technology driven, didn't resonate. And I'm pleased to say that I actually don't think that's happened. I actually think it's grown in terms of its resonance. And, for example, you're at the first conference now for the Telegraph focused on it. But and we saw, a month ago, the Obama administration committed 160 million of US funding to smart cities. So, the European Commission goes from strength to strength in their commitment, as does Modi in India, as does the Singaporeans committing to their Smart Nation program. So it's not going away, the good news, and it's getting it's a lot richer, the discussion I'm finding. So as I mentioned, a great set of panelists here with me this morning. So Martin, who's the Director of Sustainability from BRE, Nathan, who's the COO from A-Site, a cloud-based construction company, and Andrew Collins, who is Assistant Director at the GLA, and Scott Kane, the Chief Business Officer at the Future Cities Catapult. So thank you very much for joining this morning. So if you want to start, Martin, with yourself, a little bit of insight into how do we think Britain can continue to set and disseminate best practice within the smart cities?
Well, Jen, you're right in there with a killer question, aren't you? If I wanted to cheat, I suppose I could almost refer back to what Ed was saying this morning in his opening sort of keynote. But actually, I think if we're honest, what we need to do is look back a bit, actually. If we look at how the UK has led this conversation, it's interesting as we were just listening to the previous panel, you can almost go back to Ebenezer Howard in terms of garden cities, and it was interesting in that first panel debate this morning, listening to Heather, I think, from Hounslow, who was talking still about that conversation, about how they're starting to look at garden cities. So we've been in this space of urbanism for a long time. Nowadays, we're calling it smart cities. We're actually adding to that urbanism debate technology, digital kind of understanding of how cities are working. So we've actually been here for quite a while. So we have a credibility, we have a pedigree in terms of this conversation. And if we look more recently, I suppose, in terms of what we've done in terms of leadership, we've actually got a lot to be proud of, I suppose, if we look at what we've done in the Olympics. There's some really good examples there how the procurement process and actually understanding design and actually creating innovation, creating new technologies, pushing the industry to perform better came out of that kind of process. So there's a lot of good examples there, I suppose. And the examples don't stop, I suppose, in just those kind of sort of flagship developments as well. If we start to look going forward where we are creating new ideas around the circular economy, if we look at natural capital, so the stuff that sort of Dieter Helm's doing or the work that Ellen MacArthur's doing as well, there's some great examples where we are really starting to use UK PLCs almost kind of sort of great ability to innovate and a great ability to kind of sort of think differently in terms of how do we make cities smarter, how do we make sure that we've got the components that when we add the digital technologies, we can really understand what change looks like. So that's a really positive space, I suppose. And then if we start to think about what does this mean, we were talking, Andrew and I were talking before we started about how some of the applications and actually data sharing is really starting to change the relationship. So if we start to look at what's happening in terms of Fix My Street, applications where people can actually submit information to local authorities saying, I've got a problem, can you help me? So if we look at this time series of being able to use our skills and our policy interventions, looking at setting exemplars of best practice, converting that into export opportunities in terms of companies and knowledge and new skills and new technology, I think we've actually got a good history. We've got a great ability to actually incubate, to actually use creativity skills, to actually use innovation to drive this conversation. I think that's where, if we're going to lead this debate, we need to lead it from those kind of spaces of really showing the world market what UK PLC can do, particularly when it comes to collaboration. It's not about single organisations, it's about multiple organisations sharing knowledge and actually joining things together.
Great, thank you. So Nathan, do you want to pick up, I mean, coming from your perspective of providing cloud solutions for the construction industry, so sorry to correct my earlier comment, so from your perspective, I guess you focus very much on the construction process, and it'd be interesting to understand how you see the different scales at which we approach smart cities fitting together.
Okay, thank you, Jen. So yeah, I mean, we focus on the collaborative aspect of helping teams work together. So whether it's the construction, design and delivery process for construction or infrastructure, or the perspective of government or, you know, like the GLA or private sector developers who are looking at, you know, delivering and maintaining and operating assets over the long term. So, you know, echoing what Martin has said, you know, I'm going to probably use this word numerous times during the next half an hour. Collaboration or collaborative working is really, really totally key. And if you look at, you know, the last 15 years, you might detect an American accent in my voice. I've been here 15 years working with UK PLC and government to help deliver collaborative working. Starting back with Sir John Egan, who in the late 90s, under a previous government, you know, wrote or led the production of the Rethinking Construction Report, which you know had various points around procurement in particular and transparency, but ultimately was all about collaborative working for teams. That, in my view, is a major strength of the UK on the international stage. The very nature of you know, the density of our nation here, the you know, relatively close-knit nature of UK industry compared to, you know, say you know, American industry, which is much more distributed and less connected up, has led us to be a real leader internationally, in my view, in collaborative working and delivering the kind of bare bones ingredients to enable collaborative working. So on that front, the British Standards Institute is a major asset, in my view, for UK PLC. If I can pick up one example that has led in my view, to a lot of innovation and positive innovation in smart cities delivery. Here in the UK, it's the previous government's mandate for BIM, collaborative BIM, or Building Information Modeling, delivery for all capital projects, government capital projects by 2016, which is fast approaching. Now, there's a whole lot of elements to how we, as an industry, have come together to start to deliver on that. Some successes, some setbacks, some failures, and a lot of learning. The key element is standards. So how do we agree? How do we solve the Tower of Babel or Tower of Babel problem? Everybody speaking different languages and no one understanding each other. There is no easy answer, and it's an ongoing process. But ultimately, the only way to approach a solution is to agree on standards of how we're going to communicate. So, to that end, we at the British Standards Institute, along with lots of other stakeholders across industry and government, have implemented a number of standards. That PAS 1192 is one example, which is how do we work together? How do we agree trivial or seemingly trivial things like where are we going to share information? If we look at a model of a building or a model of a facility, what's the common origin point? Is it located in London or is it located in Sydney? Right? and that's quite important when you're a team working together. Mm. So, how do we scale? Back to your question, it has to start with the individual people who are involved and forming teams to work together to deliver assets, right? And then from the other perspective of UK PLC and corporate interests, transparency in procurement, and standards around how we contract together is critical. And I think the UK has a lot of strengths in those areas.
Great, thank you. So Andrew, moving on to your perspective from London, it'd be great to hear a bit more about how you think, what are the critical things London needs to get right to continue to build its standing globally as a smart city?
Okay, thank you. I think we can do a much better job of getting our own house in order. That's a complex task in London, and it might not be a tremendously fashionable thing to say in 2015, but I do firmly believe that there is a role for a body like the Greater London Authority to be an awful lot more deterministic than it is at the moment. I say it's not fashionable because normally the conversation runs something like government get out of the way and let business and industry do its thing. But I think deterministic is quite a nice way of describing government being a lot firmer in laying down its requirements as to what a technology conversation, a technology effort can deliver for a city by way of meaningful outcomes. And I think we've done the sort of broad narrative about how population is increasing and about how that puts pressure on the various sort of siloed pieces of infrastructure like health and transport and digital infrastructure as well. We need to sort of get down into those silos now and be more serious about what we actually want industry and technology to deliver for a pretty darned complex city. A serious part of being more deterministic is actually being able to communicate really effectively. And I've heard lots this morning about smart and its sort of meaning or not, or lack of meaning as a word. I think its usefulness in political discussions is exceedingly limited. There's a man with very blonde hair who no doubt is sitting in City Hall poring over his brief that I've written for him, and he'll be along this afternoon to tell you about his vision of smart. I suppose this is the time where I plant a question for the Mayor into the audience here and say, you ask him this afternoon what his definition of smart is, what he understands it to be, and it'll be interesting to see what answer you get back. I heard...
What's in your brief?
Sorry?
Won't it be what's in your brief?
We'll see, won't we? I heard a Deputy Mayor, Isabel Dedring, very eloquently talk earlier this week at a conference about cities and how they work or don't work. And again, she was perfectly frank and straightforward, and she said, I have plenty of technology companies come to me, I have plenty of people, me included, who go and talk to her about smart, and the message is just not getting through. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to work really hard to sort of turn into policy outcomes and political outcomes this really, really strong body of work that I know is developing around smart. We need to develop the value proposition as well. I'll just touch briefly on that. But again, it's part of going to politicians and saying, look, this thing called technology is actually good. It can make communities better. And I won't go too deeply into sort of use cases. I'm sure the audience are all familiar with those. Speaking very specifically to the London agenda, because you've heard about some other sort of UK cities who are doing great stuff in relation to smart already. When I look at my job and think about the things that I should be doing to get London's house in order, it's a massive coordination task. So lots of C's coming through here, sort of coordination, communication, and I'm going to touch briefly on data sharing. You heard Victoria Hills from Old Oak Common talk about this earlier. There are 33 boroughs in London. I don't expect them all to share their data with me just because I say it's a good idea for them to do so. But I think Victoria described the Internet of Things as a slightly perilous thing. It's a huge opportunity that's coming down the tracks. Work in Old Oak Common, and again, Victoria mentioned Hypercat, is coming on apace. But it won't work unless we've got a harmonised approach, a coordinated approach to making data interoperable. Otherwise, we just won't be able to capitalise on the opportunities to actually do things, create meaningful services for people, because again, I think this is the critical point about the political discussion as well. You know, we're all very good at walking around in hard hats and day-glow green gilets. Actually making this about people and outcomes in communities is really, really important. So the boroughs are absolutely vital, and it's vital, and again, talking about my role, that I think my job is to sort of make the case for smart to the sort of political and senior managerial leadership in those boroughs. That way you get to aggregate demand, which is one thing that the market sort of says we don't currently do. You know, we can sell things once in London rather than 33 times over in slightly different ways. Everybody wins by doing that. Big job around connecting and learning. There are smart city demonstrators happening in London. And again, I've sort of listened to people sort of talk about the pros and cons of demonstrators. Hugely valuable to my mind, but there has to come a moment where we turn that into a real market. So what's happening or what will happen at Old Oak Common is really important. It's really important that we tie that in with different approaches to how we develop demonstrators here in London. The thing I'm not supposed to talk about is the Horizon 2020 project that we've just landed from the European Commission. We'll be doing great things in Greenwich with another demonstrator. There is the Olympic Park, where we are both landowner and developer, and that makes and planning authority, which makes our job a lot easier. Again, there's lots of sort of cross-fertilisation of ideas that can go on there. And then there's a sort of export story as well. And one of the things that the Mayor has done is sort of put his weight behind a Mayor's export programme with UKTI, who are in the room as well. And you know, it's about exporting, you know, London's great businesses across the globe. I can talk more about that later. Just to finish off, I think doing the dull but worthy stuff is really important as well. People have already mentioned standards. I'm involved in work that Scott's organisation and BSI are doing around developing standards in cities. I used to think this stuff was so dull, to be honest. I now understand it to be actually critically important in taking that export story forward and making smart cities real. So my job, convening, collaborating, communicating, and go back to that opening point, being absolutely more deterministic about what smart cities in cities should actually mean.
Great, thank you. So Scott, moving on to yourself, it'd be great in your role within the Future Cities Catapult to understand, you know, what do you think are some of the exemplar cities across Britain, and what do you think are also some of the international examples that Britain could be learning from?
Okay, so firstly, I never use the term smart city. So whilst we congratulate the Telegraph for putting on today and hopefully running some good editorial, in some ways I find it a really unhelpful term. Right. You very quickly get to kind of the process and what Steve described as the kind of enabling technical layer. And you very quickly run past the main reason why anybody is doing it in the first place, which is the outcomes that are desired. So how are you going to help people live, move, work, play better in cities? So what do I think we do well? I think UK cities, including the ones that are here, and I'm not just saying that, they're invited for a reason, because they are amongst the pioneers. They're very good, I think, at articulating a medium to long-term vision for the city. So the Government Office for Science has been working with about 30 of the cities. They've done a really good job, I think, of kind of saying, okay, what are the outcomes that you're looking for in the city? What's the kind of future that you prefer for the people of that particular place? And what kind of choices do you want to be making to help yourselves get there. And those are technical choices, but they're also investment choices. But they're really about, if you take the example of, say, Sheffield wants the kind of inclusive growth that they think is right for Sheffield. So they're not just trying to create a kind of carbon copy of each other. I think they've also got a sophisticated understanding of the market. And by that I mean, I don't think they're being seduced by particular vendors with particular, shiny things that they should buy and spend large amounts of cash on. I think actually the discussion is much more collaborative, as has been alluded to, but it's also quite challenging. I don't think anyone's picking up any really big deals that are not going to deliver in the UK, whereas I think in other parts of the world, those kind of deals are still being done. What can we learn? I think we can learn a lot about pace and momentum. So this is a bit of a two-way argument. So in certain parts of the world, it is much easier to be able to develop a strategy, announce that strategy. So I've just come back from Dubai, for example. So we were working with them to help them develop their smart Dubai strategy up to about 6 months ago. One of the outputs of that was they need some new laws to enable public, private and personal data to be able to be brought together. So that was announced on Saturday. So from having a suggestion to actually implementing laws is taken less than 6 months. If you think about the pace of development, how many cranes there are is often a good indication of the state of development. They're moving at an incredible pace. I think that's an enormous opportunity for UK firms, but also it's a great opportunity for UK cities. So Steve Turner over there from Manchester was in Wuhan last week, and those kind of collaborative relationships between UK cities and their peers in other places, I think, are really powerful. And in some ways, they're probably more relevant. London's got more in common with world cities than it has most of other UK cities. I think every city here has more in common. I would say if we pick Stephen and Bristol, it's a brilliantly countercultural place. It kind of the way that it goes about things. Bristol is open. Is in some ways it's an expression of the culture of the place, and that culture is not the same as lots of other UK cities. So I think it works with its peer cities in other parts of the world. They learn from each other. They don't necessarily need to be learning from just other UK cities.
Great, thank you. So I'll pause there and just open the floor for questions. If anyone would like to throw a question at our candidates. Hi, please introduce yourself and offer your question.
My name's Alice McLennan from Lionsdown. I have a very quick question for Scott. You said that smart cities is a very unhelpful term and it's not one that you ever use. I'm curious what you do call them.
Future cities is one that I often use, simply because that's about saying what kind of outcome you're looking for rather than the kind of the particular technology that's going to help you get there. I also think it's, it was an agenda that was co-opted by particular tech firms for about 10 years. There was massive overselling, massive under-delivery. So I think it's a kind of quite a tainted term, and therefore I genuinely would like to see it kind of disappear out of the lexicon. However, if it means that we're able to have these kind of conversations in a slightly more focused way, then you can accept that whilst it's imperfect, it's maybe slightly helpful as well as that. I would say also that I think we're all a little bit self-congratulatory about smart cities. So I don't know if there's a chap called Sasha Hazelmite here, who's a kind of rogue economist, I'd call him, from Citymart. He has a brilliant stat, which was if you take something that's considered to be a successfully scaled smart city innovation, so something like a Boris bike, Santander bike, I should say, of the 557,000 local authorities globally, it's quite a staggering number, not all of those cities, how many of those have the equivalent of this, considered to be scaled innovation? It's like 0.001% or something. So in no other industry would we look at that and say that's a success. That would be in the margins and not really ever recognised. So I think it's very early days. I think that there's momentum behind things like open data and use of data and value through data, which is really, really helpful. But I also think that many of the really stark challenges that are being faced in cities, keeping people warm, people keeping cool, having enough housing, beating congestion. Being stuck in traffic is terrible for your well-being as well as for the handbrake and the economy. These are all growing, really big issues in pretty much every city, and we're not solving them. So,
Sure, Andrew, do you want to add to that?
A super quick definition. In my own political setting, as far as I would go, is to say that this is about the smart application of technology and data to answer city challenges, make the city better. That's enough.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Very catchy though, is it?
No, that's why I don't work in marketing.
Great, thank you. Another question over here?
Thank you. Oh, it's on. Hi, Rob Anderson, leader of Slough Borough Council. Following on from that, the issue around whether we call it smart cities, I think the danger is that you always end up, if you've got smart cities, then by definition, there are dumb cities. And actually, it's about smart citizens, and it's about having connected cities, and having people recognising that the answer is probably somewhere out there in the 7.5 million people who are connected to the internet by their smartphone or whatever device it is they choose to access. But that brings me on to the point that Andrew was making about saying that there are the traditional definition is for government to get out of the way and let business get in. And I think we were discussing earlier in one of the earlier sessions about actually sometimes the answer might be for business to get out of the way as well and let people get in there through the open data route. But the issue for the cities, I think, is we heard earlier on about rural broadband, is now some of our rural areas are actually better connected, or rather have more reliable access than some of our inner city areas who are struggling to actually cope with the demands on the infrastructure as more and more people connect devices through to the net. So, we're already experiencing that in some places. We've done really well in the Thames Valley and rolling out things to rural areas, but it's in the centre where there's just a massive uptake of demand. And it's whether we've got the structures. I just wonder what the panel thought we could do to make sure that we're not just leaving it to the market to provide, and we're taking a proper strategic view as a country and as city areas about how we're going to make sure that our networks have got the capacity, because super fast broadband today is very different to what super fast broadband was 2 years ago.
Sure. Anyone want to take that?
I'll jump in.
Sure. Thank you, Dave.
I'll, not being in government myself, I'll try and give you my opinion on the matter. So if you look at, I'll come back to the broadband question in a second, but back to the government getting out of the way point, or business getting out of the way. My experience, being involved in delivery of many capital projects across infrastructure and AEC, is that they're only successful ultimately when the client, right, the ultimate client, sets out the expectations very clearly from the beginning. So I mentioned before the idea of standards and working together. A key element of the UK standards around collaborative working is what's called an EIR, or Employers Information Requirements. So it's basically a brief. The more detailed, the better. You'll be familiar with this as a client yourself in Slough. If you just give the market a free rein and say, let's see what comes in, inevitably you'll get something. Whether that'll be what you wanted, is doubtful. If you set your stall out from the beginning and say, we expect broadband penetration of X gigabytes per second in this area, for 2 million people or whatever the numbers are, and you clearly set that out, and you, importantly, from the government perspective, provide funding for this, then the market will respond. So I believe government has a clear and critical role to play in determining the outcomes that they will receive.
Martin, do you want to jump in there?
I was going to come from it from a slightly different perspective, I suppose, because the heart of your question about who drives was something which I think was asked in the first session. I think Dan asked Ed Vasey, is this government-led, or is this, who leads this conversation? And I actually think that's the heart of what we need to get right at the moment, because if we understand who's leading on what, it will enable this change to take place. And I think your question about broadband, I think, is a really interesting one, in the sense that if we start to look at the business models that are being created in the widest sense, if you look at what the NHS is trying to do, telemedicine is well and truly on their agenda. So you can sit at home and you can take some vital signs of a patient, so before they walk into a doctor's surgery, you've got a good understanding of maybe what the problem is. We actually need, if we're going to create these new business models in terms of driving change and actually making ourselves smarter as a citizen and smarter as a community and a city, we actually need that base infrastructure in place. And I think there's an element there where there's a clear direction from government that needs to drive, and then there's the opportunity that's being created from a commercial perspective from individuals and businesses. And if you start to look at where those opportunities have actually come to bear fruit around government clear direction, if you look at sort of things like zero carbon and setting the agenda, or if you look at what we're talking about in terms of BIM and the 2011-2016 targets around BIM, that has driven massive opportunities for the industry, but it's taken somebody to be brave. And it comes back to a point I think Andrew has mentioned. You need leadership. You need people to stand up and say, do you know what, no one's done this, but actually on this agenda around smart, connected cities, somebody's got to be first, someone's got to be the exemplar, but actually you've then got to have that investment below it to make sure that you're not so brave, you're stranded. You're left there and no one is there supporting you to actually make it happen. So there's a great mix here. And I think what becomes interesting around the government agenda at the moment about dereg and leadership, you know, we'd still need some of that thought leadership from government to drive the debate. And from that, the commercial tech companies can come along, the individual can come along and actually try and make most of that opportunity.
Sure, Andrew.
Can I pick up on part of the lead in to your question was about those things called people who are out there and who are actually going to be, I think, really important in the future. And if anybody does have trouble sleeping at night, I'll point you in the direction of the evidence that I've just submitted to the Science and Technology Select Committee on the big data dilemma. Because I think we really need to get this right. And in terms of showing leadership that might turn into an export opportunity, I think there's some really good work going on in the Connected Digital Economy Catapult, actually, around sort of trust and personal data and how you get in, and I think Leeds are doing some work on this as well, actually, and about how you get people and indeed the wider market, and it's, you know, it's telling that there's an insurance company here, I think, underwriting this conference. I hope I haven't made a mistake there. But there are lots of actors here who we need to consider and to whom we need to prove the value proposition of data. And those include public services, and you know, there's some ones who haven't done a great job on this in the past, the NHS, for example, local authorities too, city government, I've mentioned parts of the private sector, utility companies. If you're talking about some of the things that you can do around that dreaded thing that we're deciding not to call smart cities, I actually think that, you know, data is a key part of this. You need to get people to sort of, through experiments like giving people personal data stores, to start to sort of unwrap that value proposition for people. And monetization has been a bit of a dirty word in the public sector as well around data. I think, you know, the time is now to have a mature debate about monetization, because it's only through that that you get to prove the value of the data to individuals who might understand how better then how their data can be used to deliver wider societal value, to deliver value to them as consumers of insurance, for example, or as consumers of public services. And, you know, the same goes for those other actors that I'm talking about as well. So that's an example where I think, you know, in terms of like data, privacy, security, those underpinning things, and again, there's a sort of standards element to this, that's how you'll drive the Internet of Things, or city data economy, as I sometimes call it. And we can take a lead on that.
Yeah, and I would argue that you know, there are other European capitals that are doing a pretty formidable job in this space. And
I don't think so, Joe.
so, you know, just from my time in Copenhagen, certainly working with the leadership there, I mean, they're very much, we help them to look at the new business model around combination of public sector data, all the city data that they reside over, and also the utility, telco, etc., third-party academic data sets and so forth. And really trying to figure out what is the appropriate governance model for that information marketplace, if you want to give it a word, and how do you put in place the right checks and balances so that the right people get access to the right data sets, everyone's comfortable. And it's not easy, but in their mind, as a city authority, that was their role, to architect that infrastructure and to set those market rules. And I guess to be, you know, devil's advocate, I don't. Maybe we're starting to do that in some cities in the UK, but it's still, I think, a pretty fast-moving race, and we've got a lot of work to do there. And I guess also touching on the point of national government and its role there, and the interrelationship with competition. I think it's interesting. Innovate UK's IoT competition is a great step, but it does cause a certain competitive dynamic between UK cities. And I guess how do we take the best of, you know, a winner-takes-all competition, but also make sure that it doesn't mean that, you know, a Bristol and a Glasgow or whatever don't talk to each other, and that there is actually a genuine culture of sharing it across UK cities. Any more questions from the audience? Sure, go ahead. Gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Carl Survey, the CEO of Shaping Cloud. So we're an SME based in Manchester, software company. We build solutions that you might call smart, depending on your viewpoint. But we're talking about exporting smart city technologies. We struggle to export smart city technologies from Manchester to Leeds because as cities, they look at themselves and they look at their economy and they look at their SMEs and they look at solutions that they can deliver. And we're talking a lot about methodologies around big data, but it's every city going away solving its own problem in its own way. So how do you actually tackle and encourage small businesses and larger businesses to actually take something that is exportable? Because at the moment what we're talking about aren't tangible things that you can go and export, they're just problems that people are trying to solve in a lot of times in isolation in all of these cities. That would be my question.
Great, so how do we successfully aggregate this demand and get it working? Does anyone want to take that on? Sure, Scott, do you want to offer a few?
For a start, I'd speak to the lady sat to your side there. She's from the Future Cities Catapult, and she would seek to embed you in our SME program, and we'd then seek to help you find projects that you'd be a good fit for. I guess more broadly, it's incumbent upon you as an SME to have some sense of where you think you have a value proposition that the market will respond to, and a sense of where you want to see your business scale. So, you know, do you want to be spending more time in South America or the Middle East? You know, kind of certain choices, which are in some ways quite human choices, because I think there is a sense of opportunity in most fast-paced developing cities in the world. And if you've got the right proposition, the right value proposition, and you're keenly priced, then you stand a good chance of cutting through. I would say that for UK cities, they do speak to each other a lot. So, you know, the three amigos here on the table in front of me, you know, if one of them is working with your firm and you're doing a good job, the other two will get to know about it quite quickly, and they'll give your tyres a thorough good kick, and they'll want to make sure that Leeds is getting a better deal than Manchester for personal bragging rights as much as anything else. But you know, it's just a supply chain. You know, you have to be thinking about you know, who sits at the top of the supply chain, who can pull you through, and sometimes that's the local authority. More often it's a firm, a different firm. They're the people that you can be building your relationships with, and sometimes you have to essentially accept that to get deployed, to get picked up as an SME, you're going to have to cut your margins right back to get that proof of deployment. And then once you've got that proof of deployment, it's much easier to go to, you know, Bristol and say, well, actually, look, yeah, we've been taken on by Manchester and we're working well. You'll pick up the phone to Steve or someone else and they'll say, well, is it working well? And they'll say yes. And then you can then get a better chance of getting, you know, your margins up and scaling.
Sure, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, if I could just jump in quickly on that as well. As a software company ourselves, I have some sympathy. We were talking before we came up on stage in the room about, you know, is there some level of inherent bias in the procurement process? For example, you know, we're a London firm, for example. You know, for the GLA versus, you know, sorry, did you say you're from Manchester? Yeah. Versus the city of Manchester, to choose local firms. In principle, there's not, but in practice, perhaps there is. You know, that being said, I believe, you know, and to echo what Scott has said, there are certain problem sets that are common to the delivery and operation of you know, city assets. You know, and I'm not knowing the detail of what you do. You know, those are the kind of problems that you want to be solving, right? Because then they're applicable across, you know, across different sectors. Sorry, go on.
Well, just so perfect example. We don't do this. We don't build pay-by-phone parking systems, but pay-by-phone parking, that should be an app. Like Uber, there's one pay-by-phone parking app, and you can go to any city and pay using your phone. But instead, every city has its own version of it, built by its own local economy, its own SME market.
Right.
And it's those sorts of simple challenges, but it's not there. There's not a marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's probably a formative market, and ultimately, you know, in my view, it will probably coalesce. So you want to be on top of it when that happens. But well, could I throw it?
One by Peter Thiel, actually, which if you want to sort of follow the Uber route, have a read of that, and it will give you 7 filters. Put your business through it and work out where you should be focusing, I would say.
Speak to the UKTI as well. Well, and they've helped us a lot. You know, not with going from London to Leeds, but with going from London to Brussels or London to Paris. And there's you know, Scott mentioned it earlier. They have a great program for UK businesses, UK SMEs.
And smart cities is a big theme for those.
Yeah.
Great. Andrew?
Just to add very briefly, I think it's a huge market. It's extremely developmental, extremely early stages. I think the time will come where there's one parking app that is a national, has national coverage. At the moment, going back to my point about data and data coverage and data sharing in London, you know, there are parking apps that complain that they can't even get coherence of data across a city like London so that they can provide one parking app for the city. Why on earth should administrative boundaries that mean nothing to you as a motorist trying to park his or her vehicle actually get in the way of a good service? It's absolutely nuts. We will overcome that. Sort of developments around regulation and standards will lead us that way, I'm sure of it. And you know, that will go national in the end.
Can I come in here? Just as a point on that. Not open data per se, but open data models. So across health, for instance, there's a programme of work going on to try to get vendors to work against a common data model, open air, which is so there's 17 different ways in which you can codify blood pressure. Well, let's work to one way. If you've got that sort of approach, you can then build it sets the marketplace, so there's interoperability, and these apps then can be. So I think it's worth linking across to your technologists, CIOs, who are working in a network across the country to try and get some of that sort of stuff happening.
I think it's a really important. So we always quote this 1960s architect called Cedric Price. I don't expect you to necessarily go around quoting Cedric Price, but the point is, he said, technology is the answer, but what is the question? And so for every startup or scale up, whatever point you are in your journey, it's really important, I think, to pick, you know the question that you're keenly seeking to answer, and then pull through the relevant team and technology to answer that question. Start with a small market. If you think about, you know, the eye-watering figures that get quoted around cities and smart cities, you know, that in some ways they're largely irrelevant. It's like, try and find what part of that market you're seeking to answer, who feels that pain, and then sell it to one or two of them. And if you do it brilliantly, then other cities will look at it and then scale. In the same way as you might say, whether you like Uber or not, what they've done is they've found a business model and they've disaggregated a service, and they provide a service that's better for us. So that's what you need to do.
Hi, did you have a question?
Yeah, sure. I'm Steve Colton from Redstone. We're a smart buildings systems integrator. And one of the things, I mean, I think Britain has got so much to offer, and the clients that we're dealing with right now, we are doing a number of pilot schemes with smart technologies. The universities have been typically very siloed. They've been developing their own stuff on their campuses. The IT departments have been very much in the driver's seat. And what we are finding is that they are realizing that with the strong migration of overseas students coming in, with the migration of students and lecturers on their campuses, with developing campuses, I mean, we're just in London alone, there's well over £1.5 to £2 billion worth of estate development going on within the next 4 to 5 years. So they are realizing that they have to understand and use that real estate in a different way. So we have an enormous amount to offer in terms of being one of the top academic, the number of universities that this country has. In banking is one of our top clientele list, and the banks are driving a lot of aspects as far as testing the technologies. They are trying their best to understand ways in which the human element drives so far as agility, not having to be in the office from 9 to 5. But again, we're finding that actually individual banks are trying to do their own thing rather than have a sort of open communal aspect.
30 seconds on our thing, by the way. So if you want an answer, you may have to ask one of the questions.
But the one thing I want to try and say is that in our pilots and in some of the stuff that we are having difficulty with, and it is a question here, is the control boards, whether it's Ofcom, Oftel, etc. For 4G communications, we're still having this issue with large enterprise campuses. We cannot integrate all the operators to get wide coverage of cellular in big campuses. Why? Because they're either overcharging or they won't work together. And that's as part of some of the challenges that we're facing, and I just wonder if you had any comment on that.
So I guess the contention here is that actually we say we're good at collaborating, but the proof is in the pudding a little bit in that respect. And going back a bit to Scott, your point earlier around, we say we're leading the charge and we've got some great examples. There's a heck of a lot of wastage that goes on as well. So I guess in reality, where do we need to focus to actually get some of this market moving in a more effective way?
I agree with a lot you said. So we have world-class institutions spread throughout the UK in many of the disciplines that make up what is considered to be the smart cities market. Those institutions are also very deliberately seeking to play a more active role in the cities in which they're based in order to address the human challenges that are being faced in those cities. Across the whole the marketplace that is considered to be smart cities or urban innovation, whatever you want to call it, whether it's how you plan, design, build, operate, fund, deploy, whatever it may be, we can point you towards world-leading firms in every single part of that economy. So I think absolutely, yes, that there is not still the right coming together in the right projects, and there's not enough evidence of how those projects are working or in some instances not working, so that there's enough peer learning and peer understanding. And instead what's happening is many of the same mistakes are being faced in projects that are taking place in relatively, within the same sort of time frame, because there's not enough evidence of what's working and what's not working. So I think there's an enormous opportunity to, if you're going to say one thing about smart, it's if we can use the emergence of digital technologies, high-performance computing, sensing, and all sorts of things like that, in a way to help us really understand what's the difference of the various deployments and interventions, then I think we would have made a big leap forward. At the moment, we're still, I think, slightly floundering in the dark.
Okay, thank you. So I think we heard we need to be perhaps a little bit more deterministic as a local authority in terms of what we're looking for. We heard that we need to actually be a bit more honest about the level of collaboration that's happening and be really true to that collaborative idea. And we also heard that we need to get clearer on the value proposition. And actually, there's a lot of a need for that, and maybe the need for it is not commensurate to the amount of work and effort that's going into that. So I'd like to thank you very much this morning for your time, and thank you all for listening. It's been a really interesting discussion. Cheers.